Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. Today's subject is a cool early morning misty scene over a river, and my aim is to capture the atmosphere of this location by using a limited palette of colours. So let's begin. I'll start with a simple drawing. My first line is the edge of the river. And we have some grasses at about this point. And we have this egret that's quite a significant shape around this location. So I'll just draw the egret in. Not quite in the centre, a little bit to the left of centre. The bird is in silhouette, so I don't have to worry too much about the detail. And that will be good enough. And it's standing on a branch. I'm not going to draw all these other branches in, I'll just paint them in with my brush later. I'll just put in this one main branch. That's good enough. And then I'll lightly indicate this path that's on the other side of the river. It's a nice design element that lets me add a bit of depth to the painting because you can see all the trunks in front of it. And then we have the trees. Again, you can barely see these on your screen because I'm only very lightly marking them in. Main thing is not to make these trees look like a straight hedge. Just vary their height and shape. And there's some birds in the water, but I'll add them in later because they're easier to position depending on what effects I've managed to create on the water surface. First step will be to wet the back of my paper. The towel is here just to reduce the chance of water running onto the front of our paper. While that's absorbing that moisture, we'll mix some of our starting colours. If we look at our reference, there are no really bright colours, so basically we're dealing with muted greys. So we'll mix our sky and the watercolour. And I'll also mix a little bit of green for the distant hill. So the sky is a warm colour. There's just a little bit of an orange glow to it. It's very, very faint. So I'll mix very pale orange colour just with some cad orange, and I'll also mix a pale blue, which you really can't see. It's more of a grey colour. So I'll start with some cobalt blue. I'm going to add a small amount of orange to it and a small amount of permanent rose. And that'll give us a slightly warm grey. And then for the water, well, actually before we mix the water, let's mix the brighter green for the distant hill. So I'll use some Aureolin. Now, this is one of those times when I can use the dirty Aureolin that's at the top. So the dirty Aureolin is just the discoloured top layer. Because we're dealing with greys anyway, we might as well use that dirty colour in this case. You can use Winsor Lemon if you like. Any cool yellow will do. And I'm adding a small amount of Cobalt Turquoise. And that gives me quite a vibrant green. And I'll dull that off marginally with a small amount of raw umber. Great. That'll do for that. And then for the water, it's primarily reflecting the sky colours, so it's just a slightly warm grey. So I'm going to start with some cobalt blue. So the water is a much stronger tone than the sky, however. Some cobalt blue, small amount of permanent rose, some of this cad orange, more blue, that's pretty good. Okay, so there are our initial colours. Good. Go back and wet my paper again. Now I'll wet my board. Okay, I'm going to start with this pale sky wash. And then add some of this very weak orange. That'll mix with the sky wash and just warm it up a little bit more. Good. Then we have this distant hill. You can't really see the top of the hill because of the all the foliage in front of it. So that's our hill done. Should have left a little bit of white paper for the path. Just lift that. There we go. And now we can put in the water. And there's a lot of glitter on the water, so to achieve that effect I'm going to put in some very quick dry brush strokes. That's the dry brush strokes is the one that leaves you with this sort of broken edge on the water's surface. Very quick brush strokes, painting through all the reeds. And I'm going to take this opportunity to drop in some green here as a reflection from this distant hill. So this is just a wet on wet mark. Not brushing through the broken edge, however, otherwise I'll lose that glitter. Good. We now have the sky and the surface of the water done. There's obviously more work that has to be done on the water with regards to reflections, but we'll add that after the next step. So I'll let this dry, then I'll paint the distant trees and the shoreline. To speed things up, I'm just going to use a hairdryer. The distant trees have very little colour in them, so what I'll do for that is I'll start with some French Ultramarine. I'll immediately dull that with some burnt sienna. And I'll add a hint of green with some Aureolin. I'll dull it further with some raw umber. My aim here is to create a very dull green, but one that's not as strong in tone as the foreground reeds in the water. So I'll add some more water to that. Great, that'll do. Because this is quite a small painting, I'm just going to use my size 8 brush to create the foliage shape. So I'll pick up some white paint, drag about half the paint out of the brush, maybe even 3/4, because I don't want it to be drippy. And you can tell there's not a lot of paint in the brush because the brush is not bouncing back to a nice point. And I'm going to be using more of a pushing action to create the impression of this foliage, barely touching the paper. And at this point, all I'm interested in is creating an interesting pattern for the tops of the foliage. Okay, now I'll darken that a little bit with just a little bit more French Ultramarine, a little bit more raw umber, tiny bit of burnt sienna, and some Aureolin. And this will add some variation to the tones within the foliage, so it's not all one flat shape. And I want to leave gaps so that you can see glimpses of the hill through the trees. And you can see how I'm pushing the brush so it's splaying the hairs. Pick up some of this colour and add some French Ultramarine and burnt Sienna to it. We don't want it too strong. We'll just use this for the trunks. Some of these trees come down to the water's edge, so they'll cross that path in the distance. Painting through any of the foreground shapes, because even the bird is a very dark shape, so it doesn't matter if I paint through it at this point. I'm going to use some of this diluted fraction and put in yet another layer of darker trees. You have to do this while the paint underneath is still wet, however. Then here and there along the water's edge you've got some other foliage. Again, vary the size. That'll do. All of this is going to be covered with the reed, so I don't have to worry about that. And now we've got the reflection. And I'm going to put in this reflection as the next step. Very light marks so we don't wipe out all of this glitter. And then, because there's lots of little ripples on the water, we create that effect by having some vertical brush strokes like this, again very light and without a lot of paint in your brush. And if you're doing it light enough, you won't lose all of those little bits of glitter you've created. You'll lose some of them, but not all. That's why it's better to produce more glitter than you think you're going to need at the end. There won't be so much reflection of the trees here because the grasses we're going to put in are going to cover that. Mix some French Ultramarine, burnt Sienna, just a stronger tone, a little bit of raw Umber. I'll hint at the reflection of these tree trunks. Then I'll mix an even thicker mix of this colour, mainly French Ultramarine and burnt Sienna. And I'll run that along the water's edge. Okay, now we'll dry that and then we'll work on this foreground area. Okay, so let's mix these reeds. In mixing the dark green for the reeds, just use whatever's left of this colour that I used for the water. Add some Aureolin, a little bit of turquoise, Cobalt Turquoise. If you don't have Cobalt Turquoise, you could use some Viridian, as long as it's not a staining colour. Then I'll add some raw Umber, and then plenty of French Ultramarine. I'll dull that with some burnt Sienna. It's good. Here I'm just going to mix a brighter green. I had a brush load of that paint and I've added some Aureolin to it. And I'll intersperse some of this bright with this darker colour just to give some variation to the reeds. This is a hog hair fan brush. The hairs are about the size of my thumbnail. They can be a bit longer. The main thing is you want one that's got plenty of gaps between the hairs and a bit of variety to them. And it's a stiff brush. The very soft synthetic ones don't work so well because they all clump together and you don't get sharp marks. So I'm going to pick up some of this bright green, or brighter green. Just a small amount like that. Then we'll go into this darker green. And we want to try and create a few glimpses of the river through the reeds. Then we want a darker batch again, so just pick up some of this colour, add some of the same colours to it. Too much Aureolin. And then these have a reflection. Now, generally with reflections as a guideline, if you have really dark objects, the reflection will be lighter because the colour of the water will combine with it and lighten it. And reflections of light objects generally are darker for the same reason. So in this case, this is quite a dark shape. I'll lighten it slightly by mixing it into this dull green I've got here. Pick up another brush for that, just my size 8. And again, it's generally darker the lower down you get in the foliage, because the foliage above blocks the light. We've got the distant hills, we've got the foreground grasses, we've got the main reflections done. We can now dry this and paint the bird and the trees in this area here. The paper's starting to dry now, and I prefer it to sort of sit flat again, so I'm just going to lift the corner, pick up some clean water and just wet that section there, or any other area that's dried a bit too much. You have to be careful when doing this. If I just had, a few marks to make, I wouldn't need to do that. Okay. This bird is quite dark, so I'll just mix a small puddle of French Ultramarine and burnt sienna. This is still a little bit too damp. If I paint through it, I'm not going to get the sharp edge I want, so I'm going to dry that. And there's some foliage on this side of our reference, which I don't mind, so I'm going to add some of that to my painting. Lots of different types of foliage. Just little dabs for some of these flatter leaves we see. You don't have to put them in, but I like the variation in my paintings. Good. All right, so now all we need to do is put in some of these waterfowls. Basically just give them a bit of a dot for the head and a bigger body. Main thing is make sure the ones in the distance are smaller, and they'll have a little reflection. And just drag some of that paint down with your finger. We'll put one or two birds in the sky. And just vary their shape and size. So smaller birds will appear further in the distance, and the bigger ones will move towards the foreground. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and again, if you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for my next one.